Good morning and welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black, retired senator. And today we've got Sean McBearty on. Sean is with the Maine First Project. Project fights against critical race theory and against transgender grooming, which, as many of you know, is designed to lower children's resistance to sexual advances by pedophiles, something that is pushed within the public school system. Fox and Friends ran a documentary after Sean received a $40,000 court judgment against the Maine public schools. They had tried to ban him from campus for exposing their homosexual book display. Sean's a gutsy parent who put up with public schools for long enough, and now he's taking action. He's appeared on Fox's Tucker Carlson show and the Laura Ingraham show. He hosts a podcast called Maine Source of Truth.
Yep. Spelled like the state, right?
That's right, MAINE, and I encourage you to check it out. So, Sean, welcome to Focus on the News.
Thank you. Appreciate it. My honor to be here.
Perhaps you could tell us. I mean, you didn't grow up raising Cain with the public schools, so tell us a little bit about how you got involved. Now, I will tell you by way of background. Of course, you know John Tigas, our co-host, and he was arrested for speaking at a public forum. And he was unlawfully arrested pursuant to illegal orders issued by the superintendent, declaring the meeting to be an unlawful assembly, something which this superintendent had no authority whatsoever to do. And I gave the speech that sort of was the shot heard around the world in the public school system that created such chaos at the Loudoun County Public Schools that the school board quickly moved to adjourn and ran out the back door. So we both are knee deep in this, and anytime that we see somebody like you, who is in another part of the country, who is creating shock waves, we're very excited about it. So just give us a little bit of background about how you got into this.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. So on June 2nd, 2020, on the heels of George Floyd's death, Minneapolis literally burning to the ground from Antifa and BLM activists, we received a letter from our superintendent in the town that I lived in, Cumberland, Maine, from allegedly the best school in the state, calling us all white supremacists 5 times in the letter. Now, it wasn't like it was a keystroke error. They said 5 times that all of the people in Cumberland and North Yarmouth were white. We had white privilege. We were white supremacists, and we really were oppressing, all of the people of color. Now, that wasn't the town that I had lived in and raised my daughters, who at that time were 17-year-old juniors in high school, at a high school called Greeley. MSED 51 was the district. And when I read that letter, I said, "Man, this isn't how I grew up. It wasn't how I was raised. It certainly wasn't how I raised my daughters." And so I very politely sent a letter back to that superintendent and said, "Jeff, you missed peaceful protest and talking to your parents and talking to your priests. And also they threw our police department under the bus. And we were the most educated, most affluent, and safest community in Maine. And that's the town that I wanted to, raise my kids in." And so what had happened, and what's happened all across the country, is we've been asleep at the wheel for decades, and these leftist progressives, sometimes American communists, had been elected to our local school board without us even knowing. And so for decades, they've been working on this plan to basically try to destroy America from the inside. And I didn't know any of that at the time. All I did was react as a parent to that letter and said, "No, this is not what we should be pushing out on our kids." So very quickly, the superintendent doubled down. He sent a letter out 2 days later to both communities, Cumberland and North Yarmouth, basically trying to reaffirm that we were not woke enough to understand what he was trying to tell us. And from there, I started to do some homework, because introspectively, I said, well, maybe I missed something. I had been out of the retail game. I was a store manager. I had 250 employees, 10,000 customers coming through the building every week, and I treated every customer appropriately and politely. I didn't care about their sexual orientation or skin color or nationality or any of that stuff. And that's the way I think 99% of Americans think as well. So I started doing some homework from a perspective of Freedom of Access Act. Some states it's called FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, and I started to dig into their equity resources and their anti-racism partners. What I very quickly found, Senator, was that I had spent taxpayer money to fund an anti-racism partner out of Boston called Community Change Inc., in which in their June newsletter, they said, in order to eliminate racism, we must eliminate capitalism and move to a socialist and anarchist form of government. Now, that's my local school that I'm sending my twin daughters to, has hired that to teach the teachers and the students all about anti-racism. And from there, it became very quickly an adversarial relationship because they didn't like the fact that I was digging in their shorts and exposing what I found to be improper use of taxpayer dollars and the very basics of education continuing to suffer in our main schools. We've never been at a lower point than we are today on educational assessments, and that's a fact.
Yeah,
so
it's true. We're experiencing in Virginia tremendous collapse in educational achievement. Part of it to be expected. We needlessly shut down the public schools, serving no public health purpose whatsoever, because we know children don't suffer from AIDS or from COVID, and so essentially we're graduating children now with a year and a half less education than prior generations. So
yeah, no doubt. It's really, again, it's the destruction of America from the inside. And I believe in my heart that whether or not these teachers or administrators or librarians or school board members know it, that's the plan. And this sort of Marxist agenda has been in our school systems for decades. And only recently in the last few years, because of COVID and because of some of these situations like I started to investigate, have we found in the last few years really what's going on. And parents are shocked. So that adversarial relationship, essentially, they conspired to have me arrested at a school board meeting. I had John on my podcast a couple of weeks ago, so that was kind of an interesting discussion. They didn't arrest me. I called their bluff, basically. They had conspired with the town manager and the police chief. And all I was trying to do is hold them accountable to their public comment policy. And they weren't adhering to that. So I was working off of my First Amendment rights, which again, I've found out a lot about in the last couple of years. Redress of grievances, peaceful protest, and free speech are something that all Americans have. And they just hated it because I'd go to the microphone and I would just speak the truth about what was going on. So long story short, with that school system, I got into a pretty public battle. And ultimately, the big story became the superintendent, Jeff Porter, was not going to allow me to go to my daughter's last band concert. He wasn't going to allow me on campus to see their giant photos that they had for graduation. And lastly, he was not going to allow me to go to my 18-year-old senior daughter, twin daughter's graduation, if you can believe that, because I continued to expose what was going on in the school system. That ultimately became a global story, which started out with Tucker Carlson, Harris Faulkner, Sky News Australia. And really, it started to bring a lot of awareness. I had people across the country, Senator, send me instant messages saying, I've never gotten involved in my school board. I didn't know what was going on. I'm now going to start to investigate. When I came back to my hometown here in Hamden, Maine, where I live now, I just kind of wanted to set, press reset. The girls had graduated. Ultimately, patriots across the country put pressure on Jeff Porter, the superintendent. He caved. He kind of curled up in a fetal position, allowed me to go to all three events, which all went off without a hitch. There was no other reason for me to be there except for as a dad and to support my kids. And I moved back to my hometown here in Hamden, where I grew up. And ultimately, friends and family here said, hey, you spoke for parents down in Cumberland. Do you know how bad the Hamden school system is? And honestly, Senator, I kind of just bowed my head and said no. And I heard story after story about the hypersexualization of minors. which is now kind of how we've evolved into this process. We started with critical race theory. Critical race theory, to me, time you are pushing skin color over content of character. And now we're into hypersexualization. And hypersexualization, to me, an easy way to describe it is anytime that a school official is talking to a student, a minor student, about sexual activity outside of sex ed. And that's the grooming process that we're seeing in schools now. So I began to do some homework on a local school board member's book list. I found anti-father, anti-police, transgender, LGBTQ, and hardcore kiddie porn titles that they were pushing to 11-year-olds in middle school with prizes and incentives. They were incentivizing these kids, these minors, to read pornography, because what they're trying to do now, Senator, is normalize sexual activity in kids. And ultimately, that became the story. I've been on Russian television telling that story. So the hard part is, and I think this is some of the things that you face here with your podcast, is I think we're in a 3-part play. And the first part has been exposure. And I still believe we're only at the top 10% of the iceberg, the other 90% at the below the waterline, the really, really, really bad stuff, the evil stuff. We're just starting to dig into because it's biblically bad in these schools. The second part of this play is trying to speak to solutions, which many parents are doing. Locally, Herman parents, the next town over, are working on solutions to try to get some of these sexualized materials out of their schools. But lastly, what I think parents and listeners, watchers, viewers all have to know is the majority of these school boards will not move. They will not move off of their position because you've got some really bad actors in these school boards. And the real solution is taking back local control, at least in Maine. And again, in Virginia, you've had a lot of situations. I had Ian Pryor on the podcast many, many months ago. And you're now starting to see parents through recall or through voting step up and try to have conservatives or just critical thinking people on these school boards to change the direction, because the only two things, at least in Maine, that school boards are responsible for are, one, providing policy, and two, holding the superintendent accountable. So if you have a school board who actually can critically think and doesn't think that hypersexualization is something we need, which the results show it isn't, then you hold the superintendent accountable or you find somebody else to do the job.
Yeah, well, are you finding that during public hearings that you have parents who are willing not just to discuss policy, but to attack the school board members verbally for what they are doing, to hold them personally accountable? I'll give you an example.
Sure.
When we had the huge explosion, the shock wave that came out of Loudoun County, I was the 51st speaker. Everybody was allowed 1 minute to speak. There had been excellent presentations by 50 people. And I think what jarred the whole board meeting was that instead of discussing details of the board proposal, which was going to pass no matter what we did, I went directly after the school board members. Now, I generalized, I didn't, pick out a particular name, but I, referred to the school board generally, and I said, you are teaching our children to hate one another with critical race theory, and you're teaching them sexual perversion. And they had created an enemies list, believe it or not. They actually had a secret list that they had compiled of parents like yourself who had the temerity to stand up and to criticize what they were doing. And the idea was to punish all of these parents who had spoken out. And I attacked them for this. And that it seemed to be a bit of a revelation to people. Yeah, we're not just talking about policy, we're talking about the people who implement the policy. And so have you encountered Have you encountered any of, excuse me here, have you encountered any of that sort of transition from talking policy to actually criticizing members of the board for what they're doing?
Hear me? I'm sorry, just showed a mute. But the piece there, there's two pieces. One, I'm being sued by Herman School District by Micah Grant, the superintendent, for calling out a teacher there because of what I would call the perversive attack on some of the minor children through the Gay Sexuality Alliance. She also was an anti-Trump teacher. She did a video with Bernie Sanders and the Maine People's Alliance, an anti-Trump video supportive of Joe Biden from the actual classroom which taxpayers allowed her to be in. So personally, that case is still pending. We're going to win on our First Amendment rights. These are opinions that I have, certainly from my perspective as a citizen reporter. And the other piece is in the RSU 22 here in Hamden, we won a $40,000 First Amendment case because they tried to kick me off campus, off the local campus with a no trespass, because I played an audio recording I had with the school board chair in which he said essentially pornography is okay as long as it's in the context of a book. And when I stepped to the microphone and I played that clip, Senator, he gavelled me off the podium because again, they don't want that exposure. So for me, all of these things have been, I've never punched first, I've always counterpunched, and I always punch back very hard. And the liberal or the socialist agenda, they just cave. They can't handle when somebody brings the truth and pushes it back on them with facts and diligence and details like I do. And so, again, we won one First Amendment case, which already galvanized. You can go to the podium and you can speak about whomever you want and whatever you want, anytime you want. And the only three things that the school board can do is place, time, and manner restrictions. So place would be, hey, it's going to be in the local library. We're going to have the school board meeting there. Time is we're going to allow you 3 minutes to talk about public comment. And manner is essentially you can't, jump up and down and pound the podium. And it has to be something school related that the taxpayers or community would want to know about. So you can name names and you can talk about specifics all you want. They don't want you to do that. And they've created policies with the teachers unions, the lawyers, the School Management Association, the American Library Association. I mean, it goes on and on and on. All of these woke nonprofits, because they don't want people like you and me exposing what's happening. And so I would say this is not an egotistical scenario. 10 million people have seen me worldwide on television, Senator. Yet I would say 90% of my own state of Maine has no idea what I'm talking about. And that's the problem. We're still in this exposure phase, and more people need to understand what's going on. And there are few and far between. There are many people, I mean, there are not that many, I guess, because of cancel culture, because of name calling, because people have businesses or they're employed or they're afraid for their children. And I've personally been attacked. I've had my family attacked. But I just stand firm because I just say, if we are not going to fight for our kids and our tax dollars and our community, then who the hell is going to do that?
Yeah, this is true. At a certain point, Americans going to have to stand up and they're going to have to restore freedom in this country, or it's not going to exist. The idea that somehow there's some people who believe, oh, we're just sort of all get along and go along and everything's going to be okay. And they don't realize that on the left, there is a desire to absolutely destroy everything good, everything decent. And that when they come together and agree, the only purpose in that is to move their agenda one step forward and move ours back. And
Right.
we have to reach a point of confrontation.
It's a culture war, Senator. It is a culture war. And if parents don't understand that they're fighting for their kids' lives and they need to fight for their kids' education like their lives depend on it, these schools will take their kids. I mean, we've exposed school board members in Maine, in local towns here, who say their favorite book is Gender Queer. one of the most just sexualized, graphic kiddie porn comic books. And the same school board member says they want to keep secrets from parents. This same school board member says that they want to talk about taboo subjects behind closed doors with your minor children. If you don't think that these people are coming for your kids, you're dead wrong. And the other piece is, not only is this an attack on America, what we found here recently is, we're starting to expose, is it's really a classroom to clinic pipeline. So these folks want to destroy America from the inside out, but they also want to make money while they're still living on this planet. And this is $1 billion scenario where big pharma and big medical, like Boston Children's Hospital. I was down there a couple Saturdays ago, peaceful protesting with Billboard Chris, who has exposed a ton of this stuff in local hospitals. Boston Children's said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, I have the video on my Main Source of Truth Rumble page, where their spokesman says many of the hospitals would perform a top surgery. So they call this top surgery because ripping out your breasts in a double mastectomy sounds horrific, but that's what it is. But they'll do these top surgeries on 15-year-old healthy girls. And it's like cutting off your arm because you have mental illness, because you've got some sort of gender dysphoria or some sort of a mental issue questioning about your sexuality. But this, again, the clinic, it's basically the classroom to clinic pipeline is the money-making aspect of why everything is happening right now in these schools, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's a long-term, long-lasting movement on the left. It goes, oh my gosh, I don't know how far back, but at least to the very early 1900s. This idea of morphing sexuality. You had the Kinsey reports where Kinsey experimented by taking little children, babies in some cases, and forcing sexual activity on children. It was just filthy, disgusting stuff that it began to be picked up by academia and some of these left-wing schools, and it's just progressed.
Well, let me raise you one there. So first off, gender is not a word that I will ever use. There are two sexes. God gives you your sex at birth. You're either male or female. That's it. Gender is a term made up by a pedophile named John Money. And anybody can go back and research John Money. He's a horrible human being. He was basically someone who pushed pedophilia. He did testing on two brothers. These brothers later committed suicide because they were just so mentally messed up by this guy. But gender is not a word that I would say that any of your listeners should tolerate. There are no genders. Gender is a social contagion that was made up by John Money. And now folks like in San Francisco, they have 93 different genders. It's like they just make them up on a fly, on the whim, right? And so to me, you're either male or female. If I don't support it, but when you're 18 years old, if you decide you want to cut your junk off and try to become something you're not because you have gender dysphoria and a mental health issue, I think that's a horrible way to go through life. And I believe 63% of folks that have transitioned with medical surgery try to kill themselves after the surgery. It doesn't get any better. And so all these folks talking about safe spaces and protecting the children, it's all a lie. And it's all a lie that's been pushed through all of these nonprofits through the school system. I had Chloe Cole, who is an 18-year-old detransitioner. I don't know if you know her. Probably some of your listeners do, or your viewers do. But I had Chloe Cole on the podcast about a month ago. And she made a life-altering, horrific decision when she was 15 or 16 years old. And now, even if she has a chance to become a mother, which she's not sure she's going to have the ability to do because of cross-sex hormones and all of this medical transition, she'll never be able to breastfeed her child because she had her breasts removed. And again, we're allowing this mutilization or the mutilization of these young minor kids before their brains are even formed, which usually happens at age 25 or 26. And we don't allow these kids to buy cigarettes or alcohol or vote or join the army or buy a gun, but we're going to allow them to cut and mutilate their bodies through places like Boston Children's Hospital.
You know, we enacted law. I sponsored, and the House and Senate agreed, and the the governor signed into law prohibitions on sexual mutilation. Now, the genesis of this was that in Muslim countries, principally in Africa and the Middle East, they have a policy or a custom of cutting off certain of the of women's sexual organs in order to diminish their sexual pleasure, in order to make them more submissive to men. And so I sponsored legislation on several years at the request of a predominantly African group that approached me, and I said yes. I said I'm horrified by this, and we have laws on the books today in Virginia that specifically make it a Class 2 felony for anyone to conduct genital surgery of this type on underage women. And it also criminalizes anyone who conspires to do it, including the parents, including an Uber driver who knowingly delivers the girl to the clinic to have this done, anybody. And it carries a penalty of 20 years to life. And it really is not a whole lot further away from what is being done today by these sexual, the hospitals that slash off women's breasts and grind away at their genitals and
yeah, I mean they're creating, they're trying to create fake phallic penises from the forearm muscles. I mean, they basically just rip your forearm apart to try to put a penis on a woman. It doesn't work. And the difference you have in Virginia is at least Governor Youngkin is willing to work through some of these things. We have the worst governor in the United States, Janet Mills, and we are controlled by a Democrat governor, House, Senate, and AG's office. So we had exposed a story in Little Damariscotta, Maine, a town of 2,500 on the coast, a very quaint community, in which a social worker sexually transitioned or tried to sexually transition a 13-year-old girl, specifically by a chest binder. So to try to hide her breast, to try to hide some of her female, figure. And her parents didn't know. They found the chest binder in her bedroom. And that social worker is still employed by the school. And as far as I know, the school isn't even investigating the issue. Now, I hope that mother sues that school for $13 million, $1 million for each of her daughter's years that she was been alive. But that's the difference in Maine. Maine is the California of the East Coast when it comes to education. And again, as I mentioned, our results have never been worse. Senator, only 1 out of 3 fourth graders in Maine read at proficiency, and only 1 out of 3 eighth graders in Maine can do math at proficiency. It is absolutely horrible. I flip-flopped between starting out thinking I could change the system, I could wake people up, the schools would just understand that the facts don't prove that they're doing a good job. And about a year and a half ago, I changed my stance and told every single parent I could ever tell, pull your kids out of these schools tomorrow because it's biblically bad what's going on, or fight like hell for your kids' education like their lives depend on it, because they do.
Okay. Now, I can't tell you how we appreciate what you are doing. Tell us just a little bit before we close, something about the podcast that you have, Maine Source of Truth. What do you manage to spread the word and spread the techniques of how to take on this rubbish in the public school system?
Yeah, so it kind of started out as a piece for me because I didn't want to wait to get booked on the local radio. None of the local television or newspapers will cover this in Maine because they're all leftist progressive. They're all owned kind of by the same company. But I started that podcast just as a kind of cathartic thing for me to be able to talk and sort of just, so I didn't go insane, because all this stuff is evil. I mean, I've found religion over the last year and a half, something that I had evaded for 40 years because I needed to find a little bit of a higher power to this. But the podcast, Main Source of Truth, you can listen to it anywhere, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, Google. And I think I have now on probably 36 educational experts from across the country. And I'm adding more every week. I don't have really a set routine. It's really when I find a good guest, I'll do it. But I'll normally do a couple per week. And I think I have 56 episodes now. And really, it's all across the spectrum. Like, we just had Jamie Michelle, who started Gays Against Groomers, on our last episode. And Jamie really talked about how she got into the situation. She's a lesbian woman. She's marrying a woman. But she knows that she doesn't want any kid to be groomed by these trans activists. And what she's really trying to do is separate the LGBTQ from the trans cult. And I'll call it a cult till the day I die, that is pushing this nonsense in the school. So we also have a Facebook page, Main Source of Truth. And there are hundreds of examples on there about Maine specifically. And there's some national stories, but mostly Maine, that we've exposed. And then folks can follow me on Twitter at Sean McBriarty. And I mentioned earlier, we have some videos on a Rumble page, which is also a Main Source of Truth, that I think folks will find interesting. 350,000 people have watched the video testimony of the Damariscotta mom, raw and emotional testimony, pleading with her school board for help. And at the very end, Senator, all they say is, thank you for your comments. So the last thing I'd like to kind of plug is, I've been doing this volunteer. I believe this is a calling. I believe that God built me to try to stand up in the face of some of this evil. And I have a Give, Send, Go account. It's givesendgo.com/Sean McBriarty. And that basically puts gas in my gas tank. It goes to lawyer bills. I have $29,000 in legal bills that are still outstanding. We believe we will win our second First Amendment case. And I just plead with all the parents that are listening out there, or any taxpayers, honestly, you need to get more involved with what's going on. And like I said, it's a 3-part play. It's exposure, speaking to the situations to solve for it, and taking back your local school board. And again, parents, if you continue to have your head buried in the sand, someday little Billy is going to be coming home and wanting you to call him Karen, and you're going to have no idea what happened. But I'm going to be the guy, and I'm going to be the dad saying, I hate to say I told you so.
Well, Sean, we appreciate very much what you are doing, and we appreciate you coming on the show today. I tell you, it's as difficult as these topics are. It's an inspiration when we see people like you who stand up, who muster their energies and their resources and go on the attack against this leftist cabal that has seized control of America. We're making progress. The school boards are on the back foot. They're defending from coast to coast. Parents are on the advance. They're moving forward from coast to coast. I think there's a great deal for us to be hopeful of, and it's just a question of whether there's enough time to save this nation or not. But thank you so much for being on today. And at this point, we will sign off for the day, and we will be back on Monday, 11 o'clock, with Focus on the News. This is Senator Dick Black. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.